sound check pretty frequently to make sure that we're on.
Yeah, it looks pretty good.
Yeah, with the earphone
Mhm.
tape on.
Make sure no CB's coming in, okay.
Hmm?
To make sure that no CB radio's coming in.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay, you're ready.
Ready?
Mhm.
Are we going?
You're going.
We're going. I'll start. My name's Karen Hill, and I'm in Vancouver. Today is the 6th of April, 1984. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project, a project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Today I'm interviewing Dr. C.W. Topping, who was the founder of the School of Social Work at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Topping, in order to get started, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born and some of your background.
Well, I was born in Fitzroy Harbour, which is about 30 miles north of Ottawa on the Ottawa River. And I've gone from whitehead to whitehead. I was perfectly white-haired then, and I'm perfectly white-haired now. And I got a funny name. I was supposed to be called Charles Wesley, but my mother had been adopted by her uncle, and his name was Coral, so I became Coral Topping. Since I was a minister's son, I've lived all over the earth. We went from Clayton to Fitzroy Harbour to Clayton, from Clayton to Lombardy, from Lombardy to Leeds, Quebec, 60 miles from the city of Quebec. And Quebec really has influenced me more than any other province in Canada, because I was there during my impressionable years. My mother, likewise, was born in Quebec. But I went on then to Queen's University and got bursaries and scholarships. Ultimately ended up at Columbia University and took a PhD and an MA there.
Well, excuse me, when were you at Queen's and Columbia?
I graduated in 1912.
Mm-hmm. From Queen's?
Yeah, 1908 to 12. I was at Columbia from 20 to 23.
Mm-hmm. Where did you go after you left Columbia?
Well, then I got a job. I had two offers. One was from the south, which offered me $1,000 more than the offer I got from the west, but I consulted the staff at Columbia, and they said, "Go west, young man." So I took the west job, and the offer I had was from Clemson College in the south, so it had a good football team anyway. But University of Puget Sound was College of Puget Sound then, and I was at first professor of history and sociology, and then ultimately head of the sociology department. And I was a very loyal Queen's person, so I kept taking the bulletin and discovered that Professor Beckett had died at University of British Columbia, so I applied for the job up here and got it. I came here in '29 at the top of the boom, but the Depression hit almost immediately. Now, it was a time of great development for social work. For example, the community chest got started, and the central clearinghouse for clients of social work. And I was not too active in the chest here. I'd been on the board in Tacoma, but I got associated more closely with John Howard Society, and I was a founding father of that organization, and am now a life member of the board.
Mm-hmm.
And other agencies, I'm a life member of the Elizabeth Fry Society as well. And I've done a great many commissions, 3 commissions for British Columbia. And one of them took us to California. I wrote up the California system of criminal jurisprudence.
Mm-hmm.
Then when I came to the university, I found that Professor Beckett had already outlined a course in social work. And I took a look at it, and there was no field work on it. So I added field work, and we persuaded now Dr. Zella Collins, to become supervisor of field work.
Mm-hmm.
And because I didn't get any money myself for doing the supervising, I was able to get other people to work for very little.
Mm-hmm.
They keep their sacrifices. Now, the staff was very fascinating. We had a wonderful staff. Dr. Laura Holland was in charge of child welfare, and Miss Mary McFedrin was in charge of child welfare. I'm sorry, was in charge of family work, and Edna Pierce was in charge of group work. Those were the basic courses we offered, but we had a great many other people on staff, including, for example, Dr. George Davidson and Dr. Harry Cassidy, also Dr. Crease and Mr. J.H. Creighton.
Dr. Topping, to go back for a minute to getting the school started, why did UBC want a school of social work in 1929?
Oh, well, the reason for that was that we were, did medieval history, and we were more backward here in social work, public welfare, if you will, than they were in the Middle Ages before the 601 Act of Queen Elizabeth. But the service clubs recognized that, and so they had a meeting, and ultimately 3 social workers came in from the east: Laura Holland, Mary McFadden, and Zella Collins, you see. And so Beckett was interested, so he made the outline for the school.
Was there any opposition to the school starting?
Oh, no, not at all. No, I was appointed head of the school about as casually as I was appointed in charge of economics 1 courses. But things developed very well. Now, at first, of course, we had very few students, I think 5 in the first graduating class. But I was primarily a sociologist, unfortunately, for the school, and was not interested in becoming in charge of a school of social work. I was interested in being a research sociologist. And from that angle, we looked around for somebody, but I think I was there 14 years before we got somebody that seemed to be suitable. I was in favor of Laura Holland, myself, who was a doctor from UBC and had a CBE, but no academic work. Laura wouldn't take it, and we considered likewise Zella Collins and Isabel Harvey and a couple of other people, but we couldn't get any consensus on them. Then some of the group went to a conference in Spokane and met Marjorie Smith there, was quite impressed, and we brought her to British Columbia for a conference and offered her an assistant professorship at the university. Now, she was also offered an appointment at Manitoba, but chose us, which pleased President Clinton very much, and gave her quite a head start. Within 3 years, she was full professor and director of the school, and we had a formal school of social work with its own quarters, you know. Ultimately, the school went to the present mansion on in West Point Grey, you see, out at the university. It's right overlooking the Burrard Inlet, so it's a beautiful location. Bill Dixon was in charge at that time, and they said he was, very unwise to choose this place because then he wouldn't get a building built. But it has worked out very well indeed. It's a lovely view, and they have conferences there, things like that.
Dr. Topping, I want to ask you a favor.
Yeah.
Could we put the pen over there, the microphone?
We'll take it.
We'll have that instead of the rock music.
I see.
We wouldn't. And I also want to ask you again about when the school began, about field work. Where did you find field work agencies? I have been surprisingly able to get cooperation from people. People will do almost anything for me. So we had no difficulty getting agencies. We'd appoint a supervisor in each agency. Family welfare, child welfare, that kind of thing, even government agencies. And they would work with Miss Collins in the supervision, you see, as a central course. And we always insisted that everybody do fieldwork in 2 agencies, not 1, you see, so they had a double choice. And some of the students, I'm thinking of Una Knight, for example, who was one of our graduates. And I think Una was offered a job by the YMCA, by a Family Welfare Bureau, and by a Child Welfare Bureau. But that was unusual. Most of them didn't get as many offers. Mm-hmm.
But we had no difficulty getting them employed. Now the problem was, of course, that the staff was paid very little, unfortunately. But remember, it was at the bottom of the Depression. And the staff actually worked 1 year without pay,
The staff at the school.
the staff at the school. You know, Harry Cassidy. I didn't mention J.H.T. Falk. J.H.T. Falk was there at that time. J.H.T. Falk, remember, had founded the school at McGill
No, I didn't know that.
before Dawson took over. He had a course in social service at McGill, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And then Dawson took over from him and became in charge of the school there. They paid Dawson $1,000, and it was much criticized. That's why I didn't take pay for supervising it here.
You didn't take pay for supervising the school?
No, I worked for 14 years, only $14,000.
Well, tell me more about that. You were working full-time as a professor of what?
Well, I was, at that time, associate professor of sociology, economics, and political science, you see. And the situation was bad. We don't want to go into it too much. I was almost fired, but on top, because I was the last man on the staff, when I took over, the head of the philosophy department retired in that year. So I taught philosophy as well, of course, in ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So I taught ethics as well as sociology and economics. Everybody taught a course of economics, a section, and there'd be 200 or 300 students in that. But Dave, friend Dave, administered business administration, and I administered sociology, and Angus was in charge of political science. And we had Boggs here in charge of economics originally, but Boggs went to California, to Stanford, as a matter of fact.
So, during that time, during the Depression, was it hard to get students?
Well, students, Dean Buchanan decided we'd have the ugliest looking people on staff, but I delivered one after pretty girls for that reason. So we ran almost a beauty contest. But the people we tried to get, you see, were people who were competent. Many were school teachers who would like to go into social work. Some were nurses who would like to go into social work. But your problem was to get them to quit a full-paying job and take a year off. So we found that very difficult. But we got some very, very excellent students, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I have kept all my books, so I have all the marks everybody took, and the names of all these people, if anybody is interested.
Mm-hmm. Were there student bursaries in those days for the people who came?
I don't think so, no, not in my time.
Mm-hmm. What happened when the war broke out? How did that affect the School of Social Work?
Well, I became number 2 man in the COTC, which had 1,900 troops, so that affected it in some way, but I was able to do many jobs. I've always been very strong and active, so it didn't bother me, but I think it bothered some of the social work people, and I was trying to get rid of it, you see, and I did get rid of it in 42, I think it was, 42 or 44, along in there, and Marjorie Smith took it over. So I went out of the school, you see, because I was so active in officers' training corps.
What happened when Japanese Canadian students would apply for admission to the school?
Well, we had Japanese students, for example, in our COTC in uniform, and we had to take them out of uniform. There was a tremendous hullabaloo against Japanese here, and one is not too surprised. I was air defense officer of West Point Grey, appointed the day after the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. But Sherwood, for example, ran on the conservative ticket in center on the single slogan, no Japs. So there was a great deal of prejudice. So we advised these students we didn't, the public president did, but Shrum and I wanted to send them to the East Coast, where you see they couldn't guide any spies or anything like that. But the handling of the Japanese, I think, was unfortunate, not in the ways they are saying. They say they never got any pay for what was seized. I knew Fred Field very well, and Fred Field was in charge of the Japanese goods, you see, and services. And what Fred objected to was they claimed pay for goodwill, and Fred couldn't see that there was any goodwill. But it was very unfortunate because, you see, the whole group were taken out, and the result was their stores had very little value, and then they seized all their ships. The Japanese claimed they didn't get any pay for it. I can't believe that. I'm going to check on that. But they claimed that one we had even in Jerry DeRussia's program, that this Japanese claimed that this was his boat. But the Japanese went to the interior. I inspected where they went. But when the Japanese get talking very strongly about what happened to them, I think of what happened to the people in their camps, which were much worse than ours now. Seems to me Canadians remind me of the medieval people who used to get hair shirts and they used to whip themselves. You know, we seem so conscientious today about the sins of our ancestors, but that has nothing to do with school of social work, I think.
No, I was inquiring about the Japanese Canadians that were at the school at the time.
Yes.
Just wondering what was
Well,
happening with them.
I never had any Japanese Canadians in the school in my time.
No.
No, but they were in the officers training corps.
You've mentioned the faculty and who was on staff when the school first started. How did things change over the years from 1929 to 42 when you were director?
Well, we had better. We got to see Harry Cassidy and George Davidson on, which were very top-ranked people, and Dr. Crease came on, you see. So, but I think the staff throughout the whole thing was very, very competent. Laura Holland is one of the most greatest women I have ever had the privilege of meeting. She really was like Mother Teresa. You know, not operating in the same way,
Yeah.
but very, very effective. And Mary McFadden, of course, very competent. The only person that ever had any criticism was Mary King, but she had a very difficult job. She was teaching, you see, social work and the law, about which was pretty complicated. And so,
Go ahead.
but they criticized her a bit on that. But I felt the staff was very top rate.
And did the students change much over those years?
Well, we got students with more, I'm not sure, but I think we got students with more academic preparation. You see, we had Isabel Harvey come in now. Isabel was an MA, and she took the course, and Dorothy Kuhn took it, and I've already mentioned Una Knipe. But one of the changes was we began to get men, and the female teachers were not too fond about the men. I got one boy persuaded him to come in, and they accused him of being a homosexual, but I don't know whether he was or not. He dropped out. Ira Stoddard, his name was.
Did the female teachers have trouble with the male students?
No? Oh, no, I don't think so. No, later, you see, when salaries began going up, male students began coming in. But at first, I don't know. I think Stoddard was the first one. He didn't stay with us. But we had Roy Stobie, you see, who was from First Church downtown here. Been a social worker for a long time. He took the course. And then others who have gone very higher. But they were after Miss Smith came along. She was the one who recruited the men more than I did. I felt, you see, that social work was a woman's profession, and I didn't think a man should be head of it. I thought a woman should be head of it. But men have been head of it recently. Any good jobs, the men always take. So that even in social work, you people should push these men out. Because women need some. I advise the Japanese, you see, when they were criticized, you get your own jobs, create your own mills. And my friends didn't like it. But that's the way for women to do, to run their own organization. But I feel that as soon as salaries get up, you see, the men push the women out. And they've done that in social work. And it isn't fair. They're treated worse than the Japanese.
Um, during that period of time, what kind of contact did you have with people in other organizations? Like, I know that Charlotte Whitten, for example, was active with Canadian Welfare Council.
Oh,
and
Charlotte Whitten.
People like that.
Charlotte Whitten came out here and gave everybody's courses.
What do you mean?
She taught every course we were offering. Charlotte was so able she could do that. So I think for 2 weeks, Charlotte did all the teaching at the university, gave a big address in one of the public hospital here, the hospital auditorium, and packed. But Charlotte was terrific. And we had other. A thing I didn't mention that I should mention is early in my time, we had the advanced courses moved into the summer school. And they were taught by anybody as Mary McFadden could get from the East. And we got some quite able people from the East.
Yeah, who came?
Who taught the summer school. Well, the one we gave the LLD to was Young Husband. That was what I was thinking of. And there were several others, but Mary McFadden handled it more than I did, so she was more familiar. But we got top social workers to come into our summer school, which I felt gave a tremendous prestige. So they took those were the final advanced courses, which were taught in the summer school, and taught by social workers from the East, people of good reputation.
At that time, what kind of, or what level of degree was the school giving out?
Well, we offered a diploma at first, and it wasn't given at the same time as the other congregation. At first, we had a separate time, and Angus, the head of our department, used to give out the diplomas, but by and by, it was in and given out at the time of the other graduations.
And Angus who?
Well, Angus, Dean Angus, you know, Henry Angus, was the head of the Department of Economics, Political Science, and Sociology.
Oh, I see.
So that he gave the diplomas in the early days.
I see.
But the students objected to that, and so we changed it.
Was there any thought then of having a master's program?
Well, you see, I don't think we ever offered a BSW in my time. What I did, I got an MA in criminology put into the graduate faculty. But I don't, Cassidy favored putting in a BSW, but at that time, we hadn't any of these new degrees. So I felt the Senate wouldn't do it for us, but perhaps I was mistaken. But you see now, the BSW is in the undergraduate faculty. You get a BSW, and I have a scholarship in there for that. But the BSW used to be in school, and only graduate MSW. But they've made changes in that this year. I don't know what the changes are exactly, but you'll have to ask them, because some changes have been made this year about it. Yes.
I'm wondering if I want to move to a couple of general questions. Wondering about during the time you were in social work education, what were the challenges that you faced?
Well, our chief challenge was to get top-ranked students to take the course. And I used to have to stay here all summer because we were so anxious to get anybody that I hung around so that then I would be in touch, you see. It was very, very difficult. Recruiting was our main problem in the early days. Now, later on, when salaries were better. But I advised the students to go into the best agency, not necessarily the place with the best salary. And I was criticized for that because they thought they should get the salaries up. But I was able to persuade the government to raise its salaries. So the government salaries were better due to my influence than the private agency salaries. So we got students going into government agencies then, which were more promising in a way. But I advised them to, you see, we wouldn't recommend anybody until they were out for 2 years. Wouldn't give them a recommendation, permanent, you see, because we felt they had to prove themselves. Now, social workers either lasted 2 years or lasted forever. The good ones stayed on. The poor ones stuck it for about 2 years, and then they quit.
Then they leave.
Yeah.
Were there other challenges that you remember particularly about that time in your career?
Well, for myself, I was, you see, I had a number of options. One was we should have started the school much earlier. You see, we could have had a school of social work and sociology. And then when anthropology developed, I taught the first anthropology courses, you see. When anthropology developed, we could have had a school of sociology and anthropology with a school of social work going on its own. But that isn't the way things went, you see. But we had challenges to, President Klink was not too good at getting contacts with the city. You see, the university was more or less apart, so I was very active in taking the university into the city and was president of a good many organizations, UN, for example, and the British Columbia Division of Social Service organization that was at headquarters in the East. And that was interesting because I used to go to Woodbridge every year, present myself. He would give me a check for $500.
And did they?
He did, yes.
Uh-huh.
He gave me a check for $500 while I was president. And later on, you see, the First Church, Woodbridge, gave a tremendous gift to First Church. And it was in the name of their father, for which I was very pleased. I think they had become Anglicans by that time. First Church is United Church. And the father was a very good Methodist.
Dr. Topping, I'm wondering as my final question, and you may have more that you want to say, but if you could think back about the time that you were a social work educator, what are the things about which you're most pleased? What accomplishments as a social work educator are you most pleased about?
Well, I think I was most pleased about the fact that I was able to persuade these people at the bottom of the depression to work for nothing, just expenses, you see, which meant that the continuity of the courses went on. Now, it might have ended at that point, but by persuading these people to work for free, we kept the school going, and so later on it was able to develop as well as it did. But that was one of the things of which I was very proud. And then I was very proud of the cooperation I got. You know, everybody worked that I asked, and for a pittance. I think those people got $10 a lecture, maybe. No, 20. Yes, I think 20 perhaps. So they get about $200 a year plus expenses. That was all these people got, and they were tremendous people. Imagine George Davison, who's now number 2 man in UN, getting $20 for a lecture.
You must have had great powers of persuasion.
No, the times were out of joint, and nobody was paid very much. But I found people so good. I, for example, edited the social work report the year of the conference, met here, and that was interesting because, you know, you'd get people to work for nothing for you. But George Davison agreed to send out sections, you see, different lectures to different people. But we didn't handle it properly. So the whole lectures were gummed together, you see. And these had to be torn apart. And that took 6 months before his staff were ready to do it. So that was one of my great disappointments. But here I wanted to be smart, and I got everything. The previous time had taken a long time to get the reports out, so I was going to show them. I showed them. Taken 6 months to get them torn apart.
Are there other accomplishments that you'd like to recall for us?
Of mine? Well, of course, the John Howard has become wonderful. We've gone from $5,000 budget to $500,000. And there now, you see, they have a provincial. One of our problems in the John Howard Society was Victoria, because they were close to the headquarters, you see, close to the government, could get better grants. by being separate than with us.
Mhm.
So they had their own branch, the Vancouver Island branch. But now we have 3 units all together under central headquarters. One is the Victoria, the other is the Interior, and the third is the Lower Mainland.
Mhm.
So that has worked out very well, and has quite a large budget now. And one of the better things is John Howard has been a pioneer. We started, you see, the Elizabeth Fry Society. We had an Indian worker in the courts, and we got a grant, you see, for getting each of these going.
Mhm.
And that worked out rather badly because the Indians are very dissipated, if you will. That is, they're very much against each other.
Mhm.
It's hard to get them united. So if we would appoint somebody, you see, who was of one tribe, the other tribes wouldn't go along with it.
Mhm.
But by and by, the chiefs organized the Organization of Chiefs, and so it worked very well after that. That was
Mhm.
about 2 years. But the boys were slow to learn, and it took a good deal of supervision to make competent social workers out of them.
Oh, yeah, just switch the tape over here.
But we were convinced, you see, that it shouldn't be. For example, when I was in Winnipeg, you had mostly Indians coming before one of the courts,
Mhm.
and a white person, Englishman, in charge of the court, not even an advisory committee of Indians, and yet all the Indians were there, so we sympathized with that point of view, and that was why we went after getting an Indian social worker appointed to
Mhm.
the courts.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm wondering if there's other things that you'd like to talk about that I haven't brought up through my questions. Are there other things you want to mention?
Well, they really should be related to social work, I suppose.
Mhm.
But the social work development here, you see, was pretty much activated by the people who came in from the east, the 3 women. And we got a center, you see, a clearance center set up at that time, which is very important in social work.
And what was that?
A clearance center. Everybody, they have them everywhere. That everybody who has a client reports his client to a central bureau.
Mhm.
And the result is, you see, that what we got, you know, at the worst, was clients who worked every agency in sight, you see.
Mhm.
I had a woman, I remember, coming into Kingston one time who wanted to get a veteran's pension. You know, the women got veterans' pensions. They stole them, if you will, or wangled them. But I asked her, tell her to see so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. Every agency I mentioned she had seen. So you get those kind of clients.
Mhm.
And the central agency, clearance agency, does away with that. So
I see.
we had one organized here.
Mhm. And that development of that clearance center was the result of the 3 women who came from the east.
Well, that was a part of the community chest, you see.
Mhm.
Community chest was organized.
Mhm.
And community chest is still going very well. I think they call it by another name now.
Yeah, United Way, I think.
United Way, I think
Fund,
they call it.
something like that.
They get at least quite a bit of money now.
Mhm.
So that has worked very, very well.
Mhm.
And other agencies started at that time. You see, in the Depression, I was, for example, secretary, honorary secretary of the British Columbia Committee on Unemployment and Relief. We never handled any unemployment, we never did any relief, but everybody in town who represented anybody was on it. For example, we had representative of the Board of Trade, representative of the British Columbia, you know, Business Association, and right down to the communists.
Mhm.
And we only had one argument. Hugh Dobson was chairman of it. I was on the secretary, and I think perhaps due to my tact, but I knew the point of view of everybody. So when an argument would start, I would say, well, I wonder what so-and-so would have to say about that, you see.
Mhm.
And so you would get the other side of the argument if anybody got too hot. The only argument we had, frankly, over 2 years was two of the business people got at each other because the one man wanted to run for mayor on the program that you'd have a 3-day week. You see, people work 3 days, somebody else would work the other 3 days.
Mhm.
And the other businessman was quite opposed to that, didn't think it would work at all. But it might have been a good idea. But we were very active in getting the camps, you know, the unemployed people went out to camps. And the city people wanted to send the communists out to these camps. We said, you're crazy. To send the communists, so we fought that, you see.
Mhm.
The communists going to camps to make converts.
Mhm.
So the camps were, but the camps we insisted on pay ultimately, and it became so good that they tell me the farmers quit their farms and went to the camps and hired people to work their farms.
Mhm. Yeah, the camps didn't last too long, though, did they? There was almost 300 of them for a while, and then they went out of business relatively quickly.
That was the reason that we insisted they get paid, you see, and we had union people in our group, you know, who insisted standard wages, you know,
Mhm.
minimum wage get paid. But the minimum wage during the Depression was relatively a high wage, you see.
Mhm.
And the camps didn't work too well for that reason. But the ones in the States were very much better. If you've been over Montana, where they have going to the Sun Highway, I think they call it, and that was built, you see, by people on relief.
Mm.
So you had the workers there. We never did that really, not well, as I see it.
Mhm.
But we did have these camps, and they certainly were better than having people starve.
Was it during that period of time that the people marched from British Columbia to Regina?
Oh, yes.
What, were you on the British Columbia end of that?
I wasn't active in that.
Mhm.
And they also stayed in the post office here. We were rather interested in that one, but you know, they occupied the post office here, and the police arrested some of them. And the chief result, frankly, of that was that the leader of the NDP was whipped by the police.
He was whipped.
Yeah, you know, they were on their horses, and he was on the ground. So they struck him with a whip, and that converted him to NDP. So
Mhm.
he became one of the leaders of the NDP. So the riots and the action of the police turned people, you see, against the establishment sometimes,
Yeah.
because the situation was very bad.
Uh-huh.
And I talked to a great many of them, of course, and one man said, well, I said, what you come here for? Well, he said, I'd sooner starve in British Columbia than starve and freeze in Saskatchewan.
Mhm.
So, you know, we had a good time, and that brought a lot of people here.
Yeah.
But I wasn't at all active in the march, because I'm not too favorable to marches. I'm very frightened of mobs.
Mhm.
Get mobs, you have trouble.
Mhm. Mhm.
But I'm doing an article now on trying to stop the atomic war, and
Mhm.
I've sent it to the Observer.
The United Church Observer?
Yes, arguing that the students who are making so much noise and climbing the fences are only fringe, and that the politicians, you see, can't even do it. And business people, enlightened self-interest is a very poor motive for stopping conflict. So as I argue, the only people that can stop the atomic war, and I realize how serious the war would be, you know, be the end of us all, are the churches. Because after all, they believe that God is love.
Mhm.
And I ended by saying, if God is love, let's get behind it. If God is hate, then let's get ready for what happened to the Japanese in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, with an attitude like that, Dr. Topping, I can see where you had so much, where you would be so much of an inspiration to people who were at School of Social Work during the time that you were there. I want to thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Yes,
And
well,
tell you how much I've enjoyed talking to you.
I appreciate very much your coming, and I hope I've said the right things. Now, I have an article which I wrote, which is in my last book there, and I think I better have have it photostated and send it to you, you see.
All right, I
Because
appreciate
it
that.
summarizes more or less what I've said here.
All right, great. Well, maybe we can turn the camera and the recorders off and have a cup of tea. If that
You
would be
can't,
all right.
you can't have no way of photostating that.
Perhaps if I could borrow it and take it out to the university, I could do that.
Yeah, I guess so. It's my last book, you see.
Uh-huh.
You'll find it over under that.
Okay. Well, let's take the microphones off and all that stuff.
Well, I hope there's that.
Yeah.
I guess I'll let you.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that was really interesting. Very interesting indeed. I want to ask you if you'll take a look at this release form and sign it for me if you choose to. What it is it would give me copyright for the use of the material that we've collected today.
I just wanted to get a couple close-ups of the book and that for you to edit in if you want.
Yes, please. By all
Where would you
means.
like? I sign down here?
Just a second here, I've got to get my way through. Or maybe you want to use your pen. Let's see, the top line on both copies. This one. And I'll sign both of them, and we'll get Mary to witness our signatures.
Good.
And I'll give you $1, and we'll be all legal.
$1.
Evidently, in order to make it all legal, I need to give you $1, or I at least need to offer you $1.
You can give me $1 and I'll give it to Mary.
We could do that.
Well, if you check under that dressing gown there, you'll find it says blood on the snow. That's it. And there's a marker in at the place.
Mm-hmm.
It's on page 26.
Oh,
I wrote up.
Just put it down by the book there, then. Let's see what we can do. Oh, you have to use the macro, right?
yeah, I want you to get really close and make a Xerox for me.
A zero.
Okay?
Okay, let's put it against something.
Because I'd like it to be readable, and then we'll do a shot of the cover.
It goes right back over the macro. No, I can't get it yet. Here we go. I don't know if you can be able to read it, you know? I don't think you'll be able to read it.
No? Well, I want to be able to read it, so maybe I'll have to take it and Xerox it and bring it back.
Not easily. Not easily.
Xerox at the university.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll Xerox it and bring it back. That's okay.
Cost only a nickel, maybe more than that.
So I put this on pause here.